Hello, my name is Jet Smith, and welcome back to my channel. I am the head coach for speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho, and this is a video called The Third Speaker in World Schools Debate, Crafting Convincing Crystallization. In essence, I'm going to give you a comprehensive guide for how to be a great third speaker in World Schools Debate, whether you're on the proposition or the opposition, on a prepared motion or an unprepared, and whether you're a varsity or a novice. I believe that there's something for everybody to learn from this video. If you haven't already watched my first and second speaker videos, I'd highly recommend that you check those out beforehand as well. So in this video, we're going to cover a lot of different things. We'll discuss the basic responsibilities and the structure of doing a third speech. We'll talk about introductions, framing, refutation, all that fun stuff. We'll talk about how to weigh arguments, rebuild arguments, and we'll talk about a different way to do the structure of the third speech, when to take points of information, how to do your outro, how do you prepare for tournaments, how do you be a third speaker in an impromptu round, and how do you succeed as a third speaker. So in case you didn't know, the format of a World Schools Debate is that there are 8 speeches, there are 6 constructive speeches and 2 replies, and there are 3 speakers on each team. So the third speaker is the person giving the third proposition constructive or the third opposition constructive. Note that the third speaker cannot also give the reply speech. So you are either the 5th speech in the round or the 6th speech in the round. So there are 10 things that every third speaker in a World Schools Debate needs to do. You need to introduce your speech, give it a good introduction with an attention getter and all that fun stuff. Nail down framing so that everyone understands how the debate should be judged and approached as far as the motion goes. You'll need to refute any new arguments that were presented by the speaker before you. So if there's a new substantive in the second opposition or in the third proposition, you need to refute it. Identify your paths to the ballot or your victory paths. How are you going to win the round? What are the 3 major arguments that you can win on? You need to rebuild your team's case and rebuild your team's refutation against the other team's case. You need to weigh or compare arguments, handle 2 points of information effectively, conclude your speech clearly, and then you'll also need to prepare before round even starts. Let's begin with introductions. All speeches in World Schools need introductions, including the third speech. My recommendation for third speakers would be your introduction should usually be a fundamental misconception about the motion that was made by your opponents, or a major strategic oversight that was made by your opponents, or you can turn one of their introductions against them. So here are the 4 steps to introductions. We've got that attention-getting device, a segue to the topic, a team line and motto, plus read the motion, and give a roadmap or preview of points. So those 3 ideas that I gave for attention-getting devices, and these are not, hard, fast rules. You can certainly come up with other things. All 3 speakers could do similar introductions based on the same pop culture reference, but this is where I like third speakers to do their introductions. You can get it from a fundamental misconception about the motion made by your opponents. If they've misunderstood the motion, focused on only one part of a topic, oversimplified a complicated issue, they're making arguments that miss the heart of the motion, that aren't applying to the framework that was agreed upon, etc. So if they are misinterpreting the motion, or if their arguments are not following the interpretation of the motion, then you can point that out in your introduction in a rhetorically persuasive way. You can also use your introduction to point out a strategic error. They could maybe be failing to engage with one of your substantives or one of your layers of analysis, maybe a bad answer to a point of information that puts them in a trap, or a contradiction or a mismatch between their case and the framework, things like that. Another way that you can do it is to turn your opponent's introduction. It looks like the other side of a hypothetical example, a reason why the story that they share actually supports your side of the house, and you can turn their funny anecdote into something even funnier or something even truer for your side. And there are good examples of people doing that in lots of different rounds on YouTube if you watch them. Once you've done your attention getter, you're going to segue into what you're discussing. So if you used a misconception attention getter, you're going to explain how your team has not made this mistake and is debating the motion as written, unlike the other team. If it's a strategic error, you can use the standard or burdens or weighing of the round to show how making this big mistake costs them the round. And if you just turned one of their attention-getting devices, then it's going to depend on how you did that, of how you segue. So once you've segued into the topic, you're going to give your team line or motto once again, repeating it line by line, word for word, the exact same as your first and second speaker. You can set it up differently, but the line itself should be the same. This is still the thesis or overall argument that everything boils back on that you were trying to prove. Next up, we have introductions as part of it is roadmaps. There's no such thing as an off-time roadmap in world schools. So you work your roadmap or preview of main points into your introduction just like you would if you were doing an extemp or an oratory or an informative speech. So an example of a third speaker roadmap for the proposition might be, in this speech, I'll do a couple things. First, I'll clarify the framing debate, then I'll refute the new argument offered by the second opposition speaker, and finally, I'll break down the debate into the three most pressing questions you can use to make your decision. What is best for the economy, what is best for human rights, and what is best for security? So that might be what a lot of typical third proposition roadmaps sound like. So here's an example of the introduction all put together. If the motion we were debating today was this House believes some kids have too much homework, the proposition would be running away with the round. But instead, they're running away from the topic at hand. Side opposition has proved that a blanket ban on homework throws the baby out with the bathwater, and sensible regulations on homework can achieve the proposition's goal without the disastrous consequences of their model. That's why side opposition knows that practice makes perfect, and why we are so proud to oppose the motion, this House would ban homework in primary education. In this speech, I'll first clarify the framing of the motion, then I'll crystallize your decision into three central questions that get to the heart of the motion. First, how do we respect students' autonomy? Second, how do we enhance learning outcomes? And third, what is the best way to address problems with homework? You'll find the answer to these three questions is the same. Vote for the opposition. So next up is clearing up framing, because now that we've introduced your speech, which will take you between 30 to 45 seconds, you need to make sure that everyone is on the same page, or that your page is winning when it comes to how the motion should be interpreted and how the debate should be approached. This should take between 15 to 45 seconds in 90% or more of your third speeches. Sometimes it might take less if everyone's agreed on everything and it's super simple. Sometimes it might make more if the entire round is going to come down to who framed it correctly. The goal is to remind the judge of any important considerations that your framing and your opponent's framing has on their decision. You want to try and get the framework debate out of the way as soon as possible, because usually if you're talking about framing, it's because you need to win your framing or remind the judge of your framing for your arguments that you want to win the debate on to make sense or apply. So you need to do that so that they'll even listen to the arguments you want to go for in the first place. And understand that unless winning the framing is pretty much entirely going to determine the winner of the overall round, it's not worth it to spend more than 30, 45 seconds on it. So what parts of framing do we want to talk about in the third? Well, we'll begin with definitions and observations. You're going to pretend like you're the judge or the coach of both teams in the debate, and ask yourself what way of viewing the topic or interpreting it is the most fair for both sides. That's the approach you should be trying to take as a third, is proving that your side, even if you're an objective judge who doesn't care who wins the round, is the fairer one. You're going to compare your definitions and observations to theirs and explain why yours create a more fair, educational, and balanced debate. Try and clarify what arguments apply or don't apply under each definition, and try to make some sort of compromise to combine definitions if it's at all possible, because it makes you look more charitable and like you're trying to be reasonable. By the time your speech rolls around, if you're both still disagreeing completely on what definition should be used, you either need to A, completely win that your definition is correct, and then spend the rest of the speech trying to win that because your definition is correct, you're the only side with arguments that matter. Or B, you need to try and win under both definitions. So if you break the debate into three main issues, one or two of your issues should get to who wins the debate under this definition, and one or two of the issues should get to the question of who wins the debate under this definition. So next we have burdens and standards, which is clarifying what the role of both teams is, what their jobs are to win the round, and what the judge should be prioritizing or evaluating. If you are agreeing on this, you should still remind the judge of the standard or burden that they are judging the round on at the top of your speech to focus their attention on the arguments that matter more than those that don't matter according to that standard or those burdens. You also want to tie each of your areas of clash and crystallizing questions into the burdens or standards in the weighing section. And if they have a different standard to weigh the round on, prove that their standard might be good or is fine, but that yours is more important, and they should decide the debate through your standard first. Now, the next issue on framing for third speakers is models, counterfactuals, and characterizations, which is essentially a way of saying, what does it mean to vote for the proposition or the opposition? And it has to be absolutely clear in the judge's mind in order for your team's offense to win the round. This is going to change depending on what type of motion you're debating. And there's roughly 6 types of motions. There are some really rare kinds, and even some of these aren't all that common, but you'll usually be able to see what type of motion you have based on the words that follow this house. So for this house would, it's a policy topic, and your job is to distinguish and illustrate the world of the proposition versus the world of the opposition, which would be the countermodel or the status quo. So then you have this house as actor, which is also usually a policy topic. It's like this house, as the United States would adopt a universal basic income, for example. You need to characterize the goals, purpose, and obligations of the actor. You need to distinguish the world of the proposition, where the actor takes this action, and the world of the opposition, which is either where the actor takes a different action or the status quo. If it's this house believes something something, you need to characterize what it means for this house to believe X for the prop, and what it would mean to believe in an alternative belief or to not believe in this thing, which is the op. For this house regrets, you need to make it clear what the differences are and illustrate what the world looks like of the counterfactual as the proposition, or what is the most likely alternative world where the thing that we're regretting didn't exist or didn't occur, versus the status quo, which is the opposition. Then you need under this house supports or opposes. Opposes motions are rare, but they do come up every once in a while. If it's a policy motion, like this house supports adopting a universal basic income, then you basically just follow the rules for this house would. If it is this house supports followed by like some philosophical or human rights thing, then maybe follow more of like the believes type of motion or the prefers type of motion. Then we have this house prefers motions. This type of debate requires that you characterize what is the difference between X, the thing being preferred by the proposition, and Y, the thing that is being deprioritized by the prop, but would be equal or more important according to the opposition. And you need to make it clear, what does it mean? What does it look like to prefer one thing over the other? How does the world look different? What do people do? What does this house do differently? So when should you continue to disagree and debate framework in the third speeches? Under which cases should we be doing more than just reminding the judge of key things and actually disagreeing with our opponents? Well, first, if they are still trying to defend parts of framing that are so one-sided or skewed or narrow that they basically eliminate all of the ground that you could have possibly read and that you did read, then it's a good idea to try and win on framing, because otherwise you're probably going to lose. If they have a model or counterfactual that is so vague or so specific or so utopian that it makes the resolution basically impossible to understand, predict, or disagree with, so there's no fair division of ground and arguments to make, which makes it unfair and educational, then sure, you can debate framework. And if you or they have staked the round on framework because none of their arguments matter if they lose framework, or none of yours matter if you lose framework, then you can also continue to debate it. Lastly, if they have mischaracterized the framework to make your team appear super weak or misguided, or to try and make your most important argument seem less important, then it's okay to continue debating framework. It's also okay if they made a bunch of new framework arguments in the previous speech to try and deal with those to avoid them costing you in the round. What do you do when both teams completely disagree on what this debate is supposed to be about? What do we do when we see the motion as either apples or oranges and there's nothing in common with them? Well, you should try to win the debate under both frameworks in this case if their framework is not totally unreasonable. It was just different than what you predicted. So try to spend 33 to 50% of the debate debating either the one side's version of the topic and defeat their arguments, be like, we don't think that this is what the topic looks like, but even if it did look like this, we're going to beat them. And then spend the rest of your time being like, okay, now that we've beaten them on their version of the topic, let's win the round on our version of the topic. Basically, at least one of the areas of clash that you go for as a victory path needs to fall under their framing of the motion, and one or two needs to come under your framing of the motion. For example, let's say the topic was, this house believes that high fences make good neighbors. The proposition thinks that this motion is about strong border security being good for international relations. But the opposition thinks that the motion is actually about privacy and neighborhoods. So one team took it as like a metaphor for like politics, and the other team took it as a legitimate thing that we believe in like our personal lives. So maybe the three questions that a third speaker on either side uses are, what's best for international security, what's best for trade, and what's best for building strong communities. The first two questions would prove that high fences make good neighbors on border security, and the third question might be able to prove that it's good or bad for privacy in neighborhoods for building strong communities. So you want to try and deal with both versions of the debate if you just fundamentally disagree on what the topic means, but this should happen in maybe 1 out of every 100 World Schools rounds that the framing disagreement is actually this big. So let's talk now about the first major way and my most recommended way to give a third speech. There's not as strict of a structure per se in terms of what you need to do or how it needs to be packaged compared to the first speech and the second speech. The first prop has to frame and has to give 2 to 3 main arguments. The first op has to refute and has to give 2 to 3 main arguments. The second speeches have to refute, have to rebuild, and can choose to read a third point. But the third speech, you have to rebuild and you have to compare and you have to refute, but you can kind of do it however you want. My recommendation is the most common way to do it on an international and a national level for World Schools debate, which is victory paths. You may also heard them referred to as crystallizing questions, key clashes, or major themes of the round. So you still have the same 10 jobs that you did before, but this is what the structure of your 8-minute speech would look like. You'd have a 30 to 45 second introduction. You would fix framing and refute any new substantive arguments that the other side gave in the speech right before you for about 15 seconds to a minute and 15 seconds. This is more common in a a third proposition speech than a third opposition, because very rarely will a third proposition make a brand new argument. It's technically not illegal, but it's not very common or strategic. Then you are going to divide the debate into 3 victory paths or crystallizing questions or major themes or key clashes or whatever you want to call it. And you're going to spend between 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes, but around 2 minutes on average on each of these victory paths. If you have one that is just way more important than the other two, maybe you spend 3 minutes on one and 1.5 minutes on the other two, but generally each victory path will take you around 2 minutes to go through. You'll also want to take your points of information whenever possible in between your victory paths to avoid interrupting yourself, but that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just my recommendation to use them to transition. Then you'll have a 15 to 30 second conclusion, and then your 8 minutes is over. How do we refute new arguments in third speeches? Because we're on this first structure, which says we should have an introduction, we deal with framing, and then if there were any new arguments in our opponent's previous speech, we would deal with them at the top if we wanted to do that instead of combining them with our 3 victory paths. So you have to refute new matter from the speech right before you, because otherwise your reply can't make all these new attacks. The only way that the reply can make new attacks is if the third opposition brought up new matter, which again should never really happen. So if the speech before you, the second opposition or the third proposition, read a new substantive argument, you sometimes will want to do direct refutation on that argument and then break the rest of the debate down to its 3 most important issues. This can be a good idea because it makes sure that the argument doesn't get dropped, you get it out of the way, and it's not on the judge's mind as you break the debate down, and it's less prep time intensive than trying to find a way to work it into your 3 points if it's pretty different. The bad parts of putting this first are that it's less narratively cohesive. It doesn't really get at what you want the judge to think about or break the debate down into a simplification. It risks you spending way too much time refuting it, so you don't have enough time on your victory paths, which is where you're going to be winning the debate. And it might give the argument actually more attention or more importance than it deserves than if it had just been tucked away into one of your 3 issues. But third speakers should be spending between 1 minute 15 seconds and just 15 seconds on refuting both the framework and new arguments when combined. So the more time you spend on framework, the less time you would have to line by line their third substantive argument. If you group the third substantive argument with one of your 3 questions, then you have more time for each question, but you might have a little bit less time discussing this specific argument. How do we refute a new argument that has been presented to us if we want to do it at the top as a third speaker? Well, 4 steps: signpost, state, support, and say. First up, you want to signpost the argument. Tell us which of the other side's points you're answering and number how many responses you'll be giving to that point. Then you're going to state your response, give your disagreement with the point, then you'll support your response. You're going to use whatever proof you can, examples, logic, evidence to prove your disagreement is correct. And then lastly, you'll say why it matters. Give us an impact to responding to or defeating this argument and prove why defeating this argument is enough to defeat their overall side, or why this argument now is not enough for them to win the round. How do we make our refutative attacks? Well, Dr. Mo is a very often taught thing in world schools for how to think of different types of attacks, because there's 4 major types of attacks that we'll use in this format. There's denial of the argument, reversing of the argument, mitigating the argument, and outweighing the argument. Denial is when you're saying what they said is straight up not true. We typically don't want to do this in the third speech because we're trying to instead win the debate at their highest ground or at their best. So in a sense, we want to prove that even if their argument is true, it's not enough to win them the debate. And denying that the argument is true doesn't really do that. So you can do it in the third if the argument is just blatantly false, but otherwise I would stick to the other three parts of Dr. Mo. You can also reverse what they say, which is where the opposite of what they said is true. So if they're saying that banning homework is good for learning, then you would want to say that it's actually bad for learning or something like that, right? So a turn or a reason why what they said the opposite is true is really good in the third speech because it can help contribute to a reason why you win. It essentially becomes a new substantive argument for your side if you can prove that one of their substantive arguments doesn't actually prove their side. Then we have mitigation, which is the stuff they're saying isn't as true as they're saying it is. This is okay in the third speech. It's probably more charitable than straight up denial, but you're never going to win a round because you mitigated your opponent's arguments. You're only going to win if you could either reverse your opponent's arguments or if you can prove that your arguments outweighed their true arguments. So that's why the fourth step and the most important type of refutation to do in the third speech is to outweigh their arguments, which means even if their argument is true, it doesn't matter as much as this other truth, which is our argument. Or even if they win this argument, it does not win them the debate. So these are asterisks to say usually it's better to reverse and outweigh in the third speech, but that's not always the case. So now that we've refuted any of the new arguments and we've gotten framework out of the way, we've introduced our speech, what is so different about the third speech and world schools debate? Well, victory paths are what really distinguish it. And what this means is you structure your speech to crystallize or condense or summarize the debate into its three most critical issues for the judge to think about when they make their decision of who to vote for, and you show why your team is winning each issue. Now, each victory path is a combination of two substantive arguments in the round that dealt with similar issues or themes, maybe a burden, they dealt with the same stakeholder or interest group, they dealt with the same impacts. Usually each one is going to last 2 minutes, but could be between 1.5 to 3, depending on if it's a more or less important victory path. The victory path has to include offense for your team or a reason why you can win. So it's not a victory path if all it does is mitigate or deny one of your opponent's arguments. It has to either include one of your own substantive arguments that can win you the round, or it has to include turns on their substantive arguments that can win you the round. So no just defense, because defense is reasons why you don't lose. A victory path has to have arguments as to why you do win. Now, sometimes your crystallization will not always be 2-2-2. It's possible to have a clash that has 3 substantives, one that has 2, and one that only has 1. Like, for example, let's say your team reads a principled argument and the other team does not read a principled argument. Well, then one of your clashes might be the principle, even though there's only one substantive there. The important thing is you're basically taking the 3 proposition substantives and the 3 opposition substantives and regrouping them in such a new way that the judge can simplify their decision to see how there's 3 different ways to justify a vote for your team. But how do we determine how to make these groups? Well, the most common way to create your victory paths is to pair one of each of your team's third or 3 substantive arguments with one of your opponent's 3 substantive arguments. So for example, you could pair the first prop with the third op, the second prop with the first op, and the third prop with the second op. And maybe that's because the first and third were about the economy, the second and first were about human rights, and the third and second were about security, right? Sometimes it's super easy, clean, and simple to decide what goes where. The less common but still effective way to do it is to group 2 similar proposition arguments, 2 similar opposition arguments, and then whatever is left over is the third. You could also, instead of grouping based on substantives, group based on layers of analysis. Maybe one layer of analysis from one team and one layer of analysis from another team go together really well, along with 2 layers of analysis from different substantives, so you combine all of those arguments together. This is not a rule. This is, again, just a suggestion of how to start thinking about how do we group things down. Because we don't just get to decide we're only going to talk about our 3 most favorite substantive arguments. We're just trying to simplify all of the arguments in the round down to 3 critical issues. Because even if there are 6 arguments, chances are there are not 6 different reasons to vote. They are multiple reasons that get at the same major issue. So you're identifying the 3 biggest issues, the 3 biggest themes, the 3 biggest clashes or point of disagreement, the 3 biggest questions that the judge needs to answer to know who wins. So, how do you decide what to group together? Well, my recommendation is to figure out what the core parts of the debate are that are A, key to you winning the round, and B, are disagreed on by both teams. And those should be your three clashes. Unless one of your major arguments was like completely dropped and has had no engagement, and you can prove that that one dropped argument is enough to win you the entire round, then you could call it one of your themes, but it's not necessarily a clash because there was no disagreement. Usually you want to focus on what are the parts that we need to win and what are the parts that we're disagreeing on who wins. Now, it's easier when you group by side for flowing, like if the two prop arguments go together and the two op arguments go together, and if they have very similar themes, like if your first speaker's two arguments were kind of two sides of the same coin and same with theirs, then this can work well. But I tend to prefer grouping one of each of the team's substantive arguments together, so a prop with an op, a prop with an op, and a prop with an op, because it's better for weighing and comparison of impacts and arguments. It sounds better and less disjointed than talking about the same idea in two different places as well. So how do we decide what clashes or questions or themes or key issues to put first, second, and third? Here are a couple of pieces of advice. These are in no particular order. If you are losing the debate on a crucial argument and you have to get back to winning it for anything else that you say to matter, put it first. If you are winning the debate on a crucial argument and winning it means that nothing else will matter, put it first to guarantee that you win it and get it out of the way. If you tend to run out of time or you're top heavy, put the most important clash for winning the entire debate first. But if you tend to need to struggle to fill time or the end of your speeches tend to be bottom heavy, then put the most important clash for winning the round last. Another advice is if you have a principled clash, consider putting it first. And if you have no other idea of what to do, follow essay rules. If you're doing really well, you have great time management, and they all seem decent, put your strongest clash last, put your second strongest clash first, and put your weakest clash in the middle, because that way you can kind of bury it. So we've talked about clashes, themes, questions, issues, victory paths. It's all different words for the same thing. It's just what are the three major things that we want the judge to consider when they make their decision, and how are we going to prove that each of those considerations results in voting for my team and not my opponent's team? Now that we know that, each of your three clashes has a lot of things that need to happen. This is not a hard and fast structure, but this is the best way that I've come up with and that I've seen identified for thinking about clashes, for preparing clashes before a round if you want to try and predict them, or for realizing what do I need to say on each clash. And there are 8 steps. The first of which is what the clash is, tag it. Second, where did this clash come from, signpost it. Third, why is it one of the key clashes in the first place, justify it. What have you said on the issue? Extend your substantive or your turns. Why what you've said on this issue is correct, so rebuild your arguments from their attacks. Sixth, what have they said on this issue? What are their substantive arguments or their turns on this clash? Seventh, why are they wrong? Continue to refute those points. And then finally, and most importantly, eighth, why, if even they are right on their issues of turns and substantive arguments, do they still lose the debate or still lose this clash? So why does what you are winning on this issue matter more than what they could win on this issue? So let's talk about first, tag it. What is the actual clash or the crystallizing question or the core theme? This should take you 5 to 10 seconds as part of your 1.5 to 3 minutes. And the name should make it very clear what major impact, argument, or stakeholder is being considered. It should be memorable to the judge. They should be able to, on their ballot, say this debate came down to 3 issues and remember what 3 issues you said it comes down to. They should be short, no more than 7 words typically, not including the first key clash is or the first question is. And the name should be repeated, in my experience, to make sure that everyone catches it. Because especially sometimes at the beginning of the debate, you're moving your papers around, you are trying to put something on the ballot. So if you're halfway through a clash and still don't know what it is, that can be a bad thing. So repeat the name so they definitely know it. Here is a bad example of tagging a clash. The first key clash is no harms. That's bad because it's vague, it's not specific, it makes no sense, and we have no idea what you're about to talk about. The second is also bad. The first question is, does the opposition's argument about why homework helps kids learn make sense? First of all, it's way too long. Second of all, it's not memorable. And third of all, it's defensive. It's answering, is one of their arguments making sense? Not, is this an issue that you can win the entire round on? Okay, so here are some good examples. The first key clash is student learning. Student learning. It's good because it's short, sweet, to the point. You repeated it, and it makes it clear what impact we're talking about and what group of people we're talking about. Or the first crystallizing question for who should win this debate is what is best for student learning. Again, what's best for student learning? It's good because we repeated it. It's a question that simplifies the judge's decision. It makes it clear what the impact and stakeholder is that we're talking about. Once we've tagged it, we move on to step 2 of the victory path or clash or question, and that is signpost where this clash came from. What arguments have been being made prior to your speech in the round, substantives and turns that make it so that this clash should be talked about. Here's some advice for doing this in 10 seconds. Be short and sweet. Don't completely restate or even half restate either argument, but especially your opponent's arguments. Be clear. Use very similar language to refer to the substantives, similar to how your partners referred to the substantives. Don't give them new names out of nowhere. Be generous for your substantives, as in name your partners that brought them up and defended them on the issue so that you can give them credit, but be biased for your opponent's subs. Refer to them in a maybe less powerful way than you refer to your own. Here is a good example of signposting a victory path. This clash stems from Jordan's first substantive argument about homework making students cheat and hate school, and the second opposition's argument about studying in practice. So I gave my partner credit, I gave a more clear explanation of the argument, whereas I only used a couple of words for the oppositions. So now that we know what the name of the clash or the question or the victory path or the key issue is, and we know where it came from, now we have to know why are we talking about it? Why is this one of the 3 biggest issues that the judge needs to decide the round on? This is often forgotten, but you can't really just say this debate comes down to 3 issues without explaining why is this one of the 3 issues the debate comes down to. So you have to explain why this is a crucial consideration for the judge's ballot, and that should take you between 5 to 15 seconds. Here are 4 different ways that you can justify it, and these can be combined together, or you can use just one, but you should have at least one. The first reason it might be a victory path in the first place, or it might be a key clash, is that it applies directly to the burdens or the standards set for the round. For example, this clash determines whether or not we've met the burden of helping students. So if someone set that burden at the beginning of the round and you have a clash about helping students learn, then that probably gets to that clash. Next, it's been a core disagreement between both teams. If it's been being discussed the whole time, it's clearly one of the key things you disagree on. For example, both teams have gone back and forth all round on the effect of homework on learning, and this clash settles that issue. The third way to justify a clash is to explain how it relates to the purpose, obligations, duties, concerns, etc. of this house, a key stakeholder, or an actor in the motion. So for example, this clash gets to the fundamental purpose of the school, to help students learn. And then next, and finally, we have that it is a prior question or a higher priority than all other arguments in the round. Usually this is a principle. For example, this house has an obligation to provide for and protect the future generations of humanity. This clash ensures we follow through on that responsibility. So you're just proving, why does this issue constitute one of the 3 things the judge casts their ballot on? So now that we know what the clash is, where it came from, and why we should be talking about it, the 4th step is to extend your team's arguments. Reiterate what has your team told us throughout the debate on this issue. So restate the fundamental elements of your team's arguments on the clash. This should take you between 15 to 30 seconds. Some advice for how to do this is to use familiar language. Talk about your substantive arguments similar to how your first and second speaker did. Second is to be cogent or complete. The extension needs to make a full argument with uniqueness, link, and impact referenced. So you can't just talk about the impact. You can't just talk about the link, and you can't just talk about the status quo. Third is to be confident. You need to talk about the argument in this case like you've been winning on it the entire time, because the judge will only grant you this version of the argument after you've defended it, because even if you answer all of their attacks, all they'll remember is your extension. So if your extension was delivered in a way that made the argument seem weak, then even after defending it, the argument will seem weak. Finally is to be choosy. You don't have to win the entire argument and both layers of analysis to win the point. Whatever from your substantive is what you need to win the clash, then that's what you should be focused on extending. Here is an example of a good clash extension. Jordan and Joseph have convincingly proven that students and parents resent being given homework because they already spend so much time at school that it makes them feel overwhelmed and trapped, resulting in a total negative feeling towards learning and incentivizing cheating on homework just to get it over with, or avoiding doing their homework at all. So I've restated the substantive material that my team presented in earlier speeches on this issue to make sure the judge sees how we answered this question or how we approached this disagreement. Now that we've done that for 15 to 30 seconds, step 5 is to rebuild that extension. Chances are that argument has not gone completely dropped throughout the whole round, no matter how many times you say it has. So you have to answer the arguments that have been given against this part. So respond to their denial, their mitigation, their turns, their weighing on your argument. And that should take you between 15 to 30 seconds. So some advice would be to extend dropped responses. If they made an attack and you had a partner answer that attack and they didn't answer the answer, then bring it up again and give credit to your partner. You can also defend attacked responses. If the best answer to one of your opponent's attacks was made by your partner and then they answered that answer, you probably need to attack that answer to your answer. Lastly, you need to answer new responses. If they're doing their job, they probably gave a new piece of refutation that your partners didn't get the chance to respond to. So if they made a new attack against your substantive material in this question, you have got to answer that new attack. But additionally, you have to be choosy. Group common responses together and don't concern yourself with weak or incoherent attacks. If they're only disagreeing with the bare level details or maybe an analogy or an example, but they haven't proven that the overall argument is wrong or that the steps of the argument don't make any sense, then you probably don't need to answer that low level argument. And if anything, dropping their attack on a random example in your speech, if they go for it, they're wasting time, and your reply can be like, sure, maybe we didn't have the perfect example. They didn't defeat the argument. They defeated one instance of that argument. So here's a good example of a rebuilding step for one part of the clash. The opposition tries to tell you that some students like homework and that it's okay for kids to do things they don't like. But first, they don't deal with Joseph's response that the majority of students don't like homework. And even then, the kids that do like to do homework can choose to practice independently without being forced to through homework. And second, the problem isn't that kids just don't like homework, it's that homework makes them not like learning in general, including what they learn when they're at school. So you answer the two most threatening or the three most threatening attacks to what you've presented on the clash and prove that they're not a big deal. Now you've gained access to your answer to the question. So now that you've won your answer to the question, or you've proven that you have good stuff on the clash, you have to take what they've put on the clash. That's why step 6 is to signpost their arguments. What is the other team's offense or way that they could try to win the debate on this key clash, victory path, question, issue, theme? Briefly flag what arguments your opponents have brought up on the issue that they are trying or will or can try to win the debate on. This should take you between 5 to 10 seconds in most cases. And here's my advice. Be quick. Do not repeat their entire argument, or honestly, even most of their argument. Only repeat its name or its central premise. Second, be thorough. Deal with their 2 to 3 most threatening arguments, whatever that is, their substantives, their layers of analysis, or their turns. Third is to be charitable. Don't beat dead horses into the ground. If you've effectively defeated them in an argument and they're not even talking about it anymore and they haven't brought it up since the first speech, then you should probably just focus on the arguments they have that still have a shot. Fourth, once again, be choosy. Just because you can beat part of their argument doesn't mean that you have to or that you should beat that part of their argument. Here's a good example of signposting what the other team has brought to a clash. On this clash of boosting student learning, the opposition has 2 arguments they've consistently fallen back on. First, that homework helps kids practice, and second, that homework helps teachers give students feedback. So I haven't explained the why or the impact or anything like that. I've just briefly summarized what has the other team told you that you might believe them on for them to win this argument. Well, the 7th step is where we prove they've told you this, but it's wrong. So why is their offense, their answers to this clash, or this victory path, or this question incorrect? Defeat them on a factual level, it's just not true, or it's not as true. A directional level, the opposite of what they're saying is true with a turn, and a comparative level, which is weighing. So how do we do this in 15 to 30 seconds? We need to extend dropped responses. If your partner made an attack against one of these things and it didn't get answered, bring it up and give your partner credit. for their best conceded attack or maybe 2 attacks. Next, if your best or a really important attack was answered, you need to answer the answer to your partner's attack. Next, you should make a new response. Refute the argument that they are trying to win this clash on from a different angle than your partners did. Otherwise, if the judge isn't really convinced by your defense, or if the judge is really convinced by their answers to your answer, you've pretty much lost. Try to attack the argument in a brand new way that will make it so that their speaker has to answer that new attack. This is especially effective in the third opposition, because if you make a lot of new responses on each clash to their team's arguments, then the proposition reply will have a lot to deal with. Fourth is to be charitable. Prove that their argument isn't true, yes, but prove that it's actually more true for your side, yes. And most of all, prove that even if it was true, it's not enough to win them the debate, or it doesn't matter enough. Here's a good example of what it would look like to refute one of their answers to the clash. First, on practice, remember Joseph's response from second prop that goes conceded, where he tells you that lots of kids refuse to do homework so they don't get practice anyway. Additionally, they said practicing at home is better than at school, but that assumes that home has internet access, a quiet place to work, and adults that can help you. Finally, remember that even if they win that practice is good, practice still exists in the opposition world. It's just not required or graded. It's a tool, not a rule, for what you have to do to succeed. So this is a good example of refutation because I'm bringing up a response from my partner, I'm making a new response to something they said, and I'm saying even if you don't believe our responses, we can still win this argument, or this argument isn't enough for them to win the round. So far, we have identified one of the 3 major areas that the judge should be basing the round on. We've told them where we got it from, what issues from earlier in the debate, what substantive arguments is this clash answering. Then we talked about what both sides have presented specifically, we talked about what both sides brought up. We said, why is this a clash? Why do we care? Why is this one of the 3 things you're going to stake the round on? What has my team told you and why were we correct? What has their team told you and why were they incorrect? Now you're going to do weighing, which is why is what you're winning more important than what they're winning? So the less weighing refutation you did earlier, the more weighing you have to do now. The more weighing you did earlier, the less you have to do now. But at the end of the debate, you need to prove, even at the best version of their argument, what you're winning on this tug of war of the clash wins you the round. And why is their offense less important than your offense? This should take 30 to 45 seconds. So it is a big part of each clash. Here are 3 different categories of ways to weigh, and I've come up with 10 different ways that you can weigh arguments, which is a fancy word for compare. The first 5 ways of weighing are on consequences or impacts. So you can talk about the size of the impact, which encompasses magnitude, how many people is this affecting, scope, what are the types or variety of people that are being affected, and severity, how badly, strongly, or intensely are they being affected. For example, way more kids develop a hatred of learning from homework than benefit from its practice. So that would be a magnitude argument. Then we have probability, the odds or likelihood that an impact will or won't happen compared to another. For example, students are more likely to cheat on a homework assignment than an in-class assignment. So you weigh the impact of cheating based on probability. Then we have time frame. What impacts happen first, last the longest, and may or may not be reversible. Those are all issues that you can talk about with time frame. Short-term impacts might matter the most because they're the ones that we have the least amount of time to adapt to, the least amount of time to deal with, the least amount of time to prevent. Long-term impacts might matter because they'll affect more people over time. And reversible impacts might matter less because we can fix it, whereas something like death is irreversible. Teachers will benefit immediately from time saved having to grade homework assignments. This would be weighing based on which impacts happen first, or which one do we need to wait less time to see the benefits of. Then we have weighing on uniqueness. What impacts are exclusively achievable or avoidable with the motion or without the motion? For example, it is impossible to prevent cheating on homework. It is possible to prevent cheating in class. So you're saying that our impact of preventing cheating on homework is uniquely achievable in our world. Finally, we have X causes Y or X prevents Y. This is like a prerequisiting or short-circuiting argument where you claim that one impact happening will either make another impact worse or better, or one impact happening will result in or prevent another impact from happening. So, for example, students who love learning will likely choose to practice and study without being forced. So the proposition is saying our impact of love of learning will result in their impact of practice and studying. So those are the first 5 and most common ways to weigh an argument. You weigh the arguments on the clash, your substantives and terms versus their substantive and terms, based on the impacts being more important in your favor. They're bigger, they affect more people, they affect different types of people, they happen more intensely, they're more likely to happen, they happen first, they last longer, they're not reversible, they're exclusively achievable if they vote for you, and your impacts will result in or prevent theirs from happening, or make them better or worse. Additionally, there's a different way that you can weigh arguments, and that is with framing. So some examples of this that I have are the judging mechanism. This is a really good one that I would use in almost every single round, at least once. What points are more applicable or important to the burden or standard? So if both of you have brought up arguments on the clash, but only one of the arguments on the clash is actually based on the standard or the burdens that you said the judge should weigh the round on, then that argument's more important. For example, this clash outweighs other arguments because the standard set was benefiting students, not staff. Another way that you can weigh with framing is actor responsibility. What is the obligation or duty of the agent or actors in the motion? This house, a country, in the actor in this motion might be schools, for example. So for example, the primary duty of schools is to ensure that students learn. If homework doesn't do that, none of its other benefits even matter. So you're saying the responsibility of schools is to help kids learn, so that's why this argument about learning matters more than any other argument. Then we have stakeholder prioritization, which is what groups or types of people or interests should come first. For example, students are the largest and most vulnerable group of people impacted by this motion, so homework's effects on students should matter more than those effects on teachers, parents, or administrators. So we can use our interpretation of the motion or the motion itself to make our arguments on the clash look more important than their arguments on the clash. So, for example, the judging mechanism, what are the burdens and standards? Actor responsibility, what is the responsibility of the group involved in the motion taking an action to other people? And stakeholder prioritization, what groups of people matter most? The last way of weighing with framing is the type of motion. What word follows this house, and does that change what type of arguments matter? So for example, on a this house would motion, it's a policy motion. So maybe solvency, feasibility, practical arguments matter more than the intent or the principle behind something. For a this house regrets motion, maybe we need to discuss, is regretting good or worthwhile or capable of solving or preventing bad stuff? So what does it mean to regret? And can we use the fact that this argument is directly tied to regret? Then we have this house believes, which would probably tell us that principles matter more than pragmatic or practical outcomes. And if we don't believe this thing, what do we believe instead? Or weigh based on which belief is better than the other. If it's a this house prefers motion, maybe the opposition could argue that both X and Y should be valued equally. And this clash proves that the proposition hasn't met their burden of making X matter more than Y. Maybe the proposition can say we have to prefer X because if we don't prefer X, Y is inevitable. That's why we're comparing the two of them. So even if you don't love X, it's better to have X than it is to have Y. And then lastly, if it's this house supports or this house opposes motion, it depends on what happens after those words. Sometimes a this house supports or opposes is policy, sometimes it's value. So if it's a policy, follow the advice for would. If it's a value, follow the advice for regrets, believes, or prefers. The third and final way I'll tell you how to weigh arguments in a third speech is called meta-weighing. And this is where you divide the arguments or try to tell us which division of arguments matters more. You might have heard reply speeches or even second speeches separate the debate into principle matter issues and practical matter issues. Think of the principle level issues as being more deontological, or do the means justify, or what are the means, and can the means justify the ends? Probably not. And then lastly, we have the practical, which is what are the consequences, the pragmatic issues, which is more of a utilitarian philosophy. So you may want to argue that this clash matters more than other clashes, or what you brought to the clash matters more than what they did, because it's a principle. It's the ethical, moral, philosophical evaluation of the motion. How do we prove that the principle comes before the practical? Couple of different options. You can talk about what the judge's responsibility is. The judge is supposed to be an ethical decision maker or an educator, because we're all students, so they have to be ethical. You can talk about how fiat isn't real, as in this debate is pretend. The consequences of a hypothetical action being taken aren't going to happen if the judge votes proper op. But what does happen is our beliefs, our endorsements, and our values. Those are real, so those arguments should come first. You can compare principles as well. Maybe you have the principle of justice and they have the principle of freedom. You might need to prove why one principle is more important than the other. And then lastly, motion type. If it's not a this house would or a this house supports, you can talk about why the principle comes first, because it's about what we believe, not about what we do because we believe. Then we have practical weighing. Maybe you want to say that actually the practical comes before the principle weighing. So does the consequential or pragmatic evaluation of the motion come first? Here are some arguments you can make that would say, yes, it does come first. Participant responsibility. The judges and the students are role-playing government policymakers or role-playing members of the government. And so we need to have responsibility for the consequences of our actions and beliefs on other people. Then we have prerequisite, which is even if we care about principles, principles cannot be achieved or measured without action. So we have to evaluate the consequences of our actions, including what principles they get to, but also these other issues. Then we have principles are inconsistent, which is that two people can take the same action for completely different reasons. Someone could lie to save a life. Someone could lie to gain money, and it might result in the same outcome. Or somebody might want to become president to make the country, a worse place. Somebody might want to become president to make the country a better place. But if their presidency was the exact same, regardless of what their goal was, then does the principle of why they did what they did matter if the outcome is the same? This argument would say no. And then we have motion type. If it's not a value motion, if it's a this house would or a this house supports X policy, then maybe practical does matter more. So we've talked about the 8 steps of a victory path. We've talked about how you need to name it so that the judge knows what the issue is. You need to signpost where it came from, what substantive arguments have been brought up in the round that led us to this issue. You need to justify it. Why should we care / why is this important enough to be one of the 3 biggest things the judge is voting on? You need to explain what your team has said earlier, extend your team's arguments, your substantives, and your turns. You need to rebuild and defend what your team has said on the clash or the question by answering the other team's refutation. You need to point out what the other team tried to bring to this clash or this question or this theme. Then you need to refute those things to prove that what you have brought to the clash wins it for you and what they have brought to the clash does not win it for them. And then lastly, you need to prove, even if you disregarded the refutation of both sides and you looked at both arguments on the clash as true, why does what your team is winning matter more and prove the judge should vote for you instead of your opponents? Let's talk about how to do a victory path on a principled argument, because it is slightly different. So you're still naming the clash, but usually the clash is just going to be what's principally required or the principle. If you both agreed on the principle and maybe it was justice, then you can say the first clash is what's best for justice, or the first clash is justice. Then you need to signpost the principle and the opposing principle. So if you both agree on the principle and it's a question of who achieves it better, then be like, we're debating about, who is going to achieve justice through this resolution. Or you need to say, this is a question of what matters more and who achieves what matters more, justice or freedom. Then you need to justify the clash. For example, the principle comes first in this round for all of those weighing arguments that we talked about earlier. It's been a big disagreement. Then extend your principle and defend your principle. So prove that your principle matters and that voting for your side is in line with that principle. Then you need to signpost their principle, or if they didn't have one of their own, they just tried to prove that they are part of your principle. Be like, they tried to prove that they achieved justice by saying this, this, and this. And then you need to refute their principle. So either they don't achieve democracy or they don't achieve freedom, or if they've tried to prove they achieved your principle, prove they didn't achieve it. The final step is to weigh your principle versus theirs to prove why yours matters more, so that even if both teams achieve their principle, you win, and to weigh why the principle side of the debate matters more than the practical side of the debate. So you understand now how to do a clash. You're going to do that. It's going to take between a minute and a half to 3 minutes. Then you're going to hopefully take a POI, go to the next issue and do the exact same 8 steps again, take a POI and go to the next issue and do the exact same 8 steps again. So why is this a good way to do the third speech when pretty much no other speech in any type of debate structures themselves this way? There are several advantages to doing a crystallization speech with clashes, questions, or themes. One, it helps focus the debate to its most important components. The topics change every round, so judges don't know them as well. You're reading new arguments in multiple speeches instead of just the first 2, so there's so much going on that it's impossible for the judge to consider everything. It's more logical when both of your team's substantive arguments mirror each other, like if you both have one on the economy and both teams have one on human rights, then grouping them together makes more sense than talking about the economy in one place and the economy in another place. You can also set up your reply speaker to have at least 3 arguments that they can turn into voters in their speech, because if you can win 3 clashes, then really they only need 1 or 2 of them to win the debate as a whole. Then it's also good because you follow the norms of what judges expect for world schools debate, especially in the United States. And you can also simplify the debate for lay judges who might be feeling overwhelmed or might not be taking as good of notes. What are the cons? Because it's not a perfect system, which is why there is an alternative, even though I think it's bad. There are a couple of reasons why doing a crystallization third is not optimal or difficult. First, it's not common to other types of debate or to experienced judges in other types of debate, which means it's a new skill you have to learn, and a flow judge, quote unquote, from PF, LD, or policy or college types of debate might think that it isn't really covering everything that it needs to, and they might not know how to notate it. Also, if the 6 or more, if you have opponents that decide to read more than 3 substantive arguments for some ungodly reason, but if there are a lot of substantive arguments that are extremely different from each other, grouping them together can be illogical or forced and leave important stuff out. And if your second speaker is doing the common international strategy of identifying 2 clashes instead of refuting, rebuilding, and reading a new sub, then your speech might sound exactly like their speech if you do this structure, which might prevent your ability from getting high speaker points. So if you refuse to do the best system that everyone agrees on pretty much of 3 clashes or questions, what can you do instead? Technically speaking, there are no rules of what you have to do in the third, so this is the other way of structuring it, and that is an issue by issue rebuttal, which is very similar to what other types of debate would do if they were given this speech. You have an introduction and you fix your framing just like the other side. But then you're going to break down your team's 3 substantive arguments and extend them and rebuild them and weigh them one at a time. So sub 1, sub 2, sub 3. Hopefully take a point of information. And then you do the same thing, but reverse for your opponents. Go through each of their substantive arguments, extend your team's attacks, and prove why they don't matter, or why the other team's argument doesn't matter. And you give a second point of information. Then you're going to weigh the arguments now that your team's arguments have all been defended and extended and their team's arguments have all been effectively refuted. Weigh your arguments versus theirs. So assuming that your points are true and their points are true, why do you still win the debate? And then give an outro. So it's all of the same requirements as when you do clashes. You're just trying to do all of the steps essentially separately. And with, more time maybe dedicated to each individual issue, but less time dedicated to big picture thinking. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of this, like we went over. You're less likely to maybe drop itty-bitty line-by-line responses, but you're also going to be more blippy, and you're not going to get to focus on the round-winning issues. You don't need 6 different reasons to win the round. And this structure forces you to try and win the round in 6 different places, or it's a waste of your time. So I would not recommend this structure, but your coach might. And sometimes if you're in an elimination round in particular, and you're in front of a judge who doesn't have the rubric pulled up and they are a policy LD or PF flow judge, then maybe this type of rebuttal for the third speech is better. How do we as a third speaker prepare for a World Schools debate tournament before it happens? There are 5 things that you need to do. You need to stay informed in the news, help your team with case writing, anticipate what the arguments of the other team are likely to be, identify likely or possible clashes, and prepare weighing analysis. So third speech points of information, how many you should take and when you should take them. You should take 2 points of information in every speech and take them at spaced out interviews. We'll talk more about the pre-tourney prep right after this. I just wanted to give a brief overview. You should also try to take 1 point of information in the first half of your speech and 1 in the second half of your speech. Ideally, you'll take 1 at the end of your first clash or at the end of talking about your team's 3 substantive arguments if you're doing structure 2, and you'll take 1 at the end of your second clash or at the end of talking about your opponent's 3 substantive arguments if you're doing structure 2. You should never interrupt yourself halfway through a sentence, a thought, or a major issue to take a point. Either wave them down, hold up a finger to let them know you'll take their point at the end of this thought, or accept them if you're miraculously moving between major ideas. If you can't take them when switching between major points of a speech, try to take them when switching between key thoughts and ideas. Maybe you can't take them between your first and second clash, but maybe you can take them between talking about your matter on a clash and their matter on a clash. Either way, use points of information to transition between ideas. Next, how do we conclude our speech? What do we do for the outro? This should take 15 to 30 seconds, and a lot of the times they get skipped by debaters that lack discipline and time management. But skipping an outro will hurt your style, hurt your content, and hurt your strategy. They're persuasive, they let you slow down and can be well rehearsed, which makes you better at style. They're part of persuasive speech expectations and oratory informative extemp, and they help remind the judges of your team line and main points, which helps you with strategy. Outros also showcase excellent time management skills to the judge. And if your speech is top heavy and you skip the outro or rush through your second substantive, both of those would hurt your content and your strategy scores. Some judges may also consider part of what you need to present in content an outro. So all 3 scores are at least going to be benefited in some way by having an outro, and you probably won't be hurt by having the last 15 seconds of your speech be a focused underview of why you win. So how do we do an outro? We tie back to our attention-getting device, go back to your story, your turn against their case, your strategic misstep, your fundamental misconception about the round from the other team. Then you review your team's main points that you review. We broke this debate down into 3 issues: this clash, this clash, this clash, and then finish with your team's line and you're being proud to oppose or propose. So now that we've talked about the points of information and outros and conclusions, let's go back to that thing about what do we do before the tournament as a third speaker. As a third speaker, you need to stay up to date on global and international news updates to stay informed. You really should read the NSDA and other organizations' sample monthly motions, both the prepped motions and the impromptu motions, and practice by yourself figuring out, okay, what would the clashes probably be on this? What are the 3 to 5 arguments that both teams are going to read in most debates? What are the 3 groupings of arguments that make the most sense of those 3 to 5 arguments? You also should look back on your team's prior tournaments to see what arguments you read that worked and what arguments you read that didn't work as a third speaker. Then, what about cases? Now, as a third speaker, you need to work with your first and second speaker to make sure that cases are written properly and in enough time before the tournament that they can be practiced and that you can get familiar enough with them to use them to your advantage when predicting clashes. You need to know the material well, and you need to think about how to use the case to weigh arguments and win the debate later on in the back half. The third job is you need to anticipate likely opposing arguments. You can use one of your non-speakers as a devil's advocate, even on a prepared topic with this, but get them to help you figure out what is the other team probably going to say. The good news is you have to write cases for both sides, so you already have a couple of ideas of what the other team might say, but what other ideas might they say? You should also try to figure out what are the 2 to 3 most likely dangerous attacks that the other teams could make against our substantives. What are the likely holes in our case that we're going to have to patch up? The fourth thing you need to do before the tournament is to identify likely clashes, themes, and questions for each of the prepared motions that you will be debating on. Think through different combinations of substantives that your team might go up against on each side of the motion. So you know that when you're proposition, you're reading argument A, B, and C, and you've thought of argument 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from the opposition. Well, for each of those 5 arguments, if they include these 3 but not these 2, how would you group the arguments together to create clashes or themes? And you can have this as a sort of clash block file so that you can plug in place and be like, oh, I planned on this, here's what I can do before the tournament. Try to come up with at least the 5 to 6 most likely combinations of substantive arguments that could form good clashes or themes, and try to figure out, okay, of all of these clashes, which of them are the most important that my team wins in order to win the overall debate, and which of these clashes are the weakest for my opponents, and vice versa. Next, you need to brainstorm weighing analysis before the tournament starts on your prepared motions. For each side of the debate, think about how you can use your team's arguments to outweigh the other team's arguments on each of the most likely clashes that you identified. So if the clash is on student learning, if the clash is on discipline, if the clash is on parents and teachers, if the clash is on preparation, if the clash is on feedback, whatever the clash tends to be about, figure out, okay, what do we bring to the clash? What will they bring to the clash? And why can we win the debate with ours more than theirs? So remember the 3 types of weighing and try to have a variety of different arguments that you could, depending on if they make sense in the round or if they apply, plug in place. Try to have weighing for each of your 3 substantive arguments about why they're the most important argument in the round on impacts with size, such as magnitude, severity, and scope, probability or likelihood, time frame, short-term, long-term, reversibility, uniqueness, and does X cause or prevent or affect Y. You can also think about weighing on framing. How do your arguments directly get to the burdens and standards that you've set? Why is it most important for your arguments to be done based on the actors or the stakeholders in the resolution? Or figure out, are we going for more of a principled argument or more of a practical argument, and which one do we want to prioritize as being more important than others? So those are what you need to do before you get to the tournament. Now, I do want to talk briefly about refutation in the third speech, especially because there's an entire style of third speech where it's basically just all refutation, like we talked about. And here are the things you need to remember. With each clash or crystallizing question, 30 to 45 seconds should be spent refuting their substantive matter and signposting it. This is your team's last shot to answer any important information from the other team because you can't make new arguments in the reply. You still have to focus on quality over quantity. So even if your teammates have made 7 attacks against these issues, you really should only be bringing back the best 1 or 2. You also need to not contradict what your teammates earlier said. You can make your teammates, signpost them in a way that they sound better than what was actually said, but you can't really disagree with what your earlier speakers said unless you want to look pretty bad. You also need to take the baton. Whatever attacks your partners gave you, that's the ones that you need to be extending, not the ones that you wish they gave you. Additionally, you need to be charitable. Focus more on beating their argument at its highest level. If they need to have assumptions A, B, C, and D for their argument to make sense, be refuting them at the assumptions C and D level, or giving them all of their assumptions and then just beating them on weighing, rather than trying to be like, this argument is just straight up wrong and you're dumb if you agree with it. You also want to try and be preemptive of their reply. Try to predict what is their most likely response to what you're saying on these issues going to be and answer it before they even have the chance to say it. You really need to ignore the small trees so that you can save the forest. Don't give unimportant arguments too much attention. Just because you can clobber an argument doesn't mean you should. Because if you treat something that didn't matter like it was a huge deal, you actually give your opponent's point more weight in the judge's decision than it should have if you were just like, yeah, this was dumb, and basically dismissed it. But you also need to focus on setting up the spike. How do you set up the reply speaker to go for the kill in the next speech? What about impromptu rounds? How do we be a good third speaker in an impromptu round? Here are some general pieces of advice. Make sure that you are 100% clear on what the framing of the motion for your team is going to be. And if your opposition, talk with your devil's advocate about what the prop is likely to frame the motion as so that you can adjust if you need to. You also need to work with your devil's advocate to identify the most likely substantive arguments and refutative arguments that the other team will make against your team's substantives. You also need to help with writing factual, which is denial and mitigation level attacks against the other team's points, and directional or turn level attacks against the other team's points until the second speaker is done writing their intro and second substantive, and then they and the devil's advocate can kind of take over writing blocks. You also need to identify the most likely clashes that could occur in the round based on different combinations of the arguments you came up with and that you and your devil's advocate think the other team will come up with. You need to write down preliminary bits of weighing analysis or comparative blocks for each clash on each of your substantive arguments. Be like, okay, if we read our substantive 1 versus opposition argument 3, how are we going to use our argument 1 to beat their argument 3? How would we use argument 1 to beat their argument 5? And try to have some weighing arguments for having an idea of how am I going to use my substantives to win this debate. You also need to get your team on the same page for how you're going to win the debate overall. You are the only person who has the time to be doing the strategic higher level thinking of the entire round at the end. The first speaker just has to be ready to talk in an hour. The second speaker has to be ready to talk in an hour and 10 or 15 minutes, but also to be ready to answer everything that the other team is saying. So they're not able to think about winning the debate at the end. But here's the problem. You cannot give the reply. Only they can give the reply. But if you are the only person thinking about the late term strategy of the round, you have to get them on the same page about what the late term strategy should be so that they know what they're doing going into the reply. Let's talk about how to break this down during your individual work time. So after you've brainstormed, after you've info dumped your ideas, and after you as a team have decided what are we talking about in this debate, what are you doing during your independent work time? Here is what I would say. You need to anticipate your opponent's framing, so you and your devil's advocate figure out how might they define or interpret the motion to be way different than us if it's possible, or try to frame us out of the debate entirely. This is especially important for opposition. You also need to brainstorm what are our opponents going to talk about. Work with your devil's advocate to identify the top 5 strongest and most likely substantive arguments that you'll debate against. You also might want to brainstorm your opponent's refutation. Work with your devil's advocate to figure out what are the most likely attacks or the biggest weaknesses in your first and second speaker's 3 substantive arguments that they'll probably point out, and it will be your job to clean up with. This is especially important for whatever your third argument is going to be, because your second speaker can defend the first 2 substantives in their speech, but they can't defend the third substantive because they're the one presenting it. You have to defend that argument, so figure out where is it weakest and how will I be able to defend it. For the rest of impromptu prep, you need to identify the possible clashes based on your 3 substantive arguments and the 5 most likely and threatening arguments that your opponents could read. What are the most likely clashes and groupings, themes, points, questions, things like that. Fifth, you need to write down weighing arguments. So for each of the clashes that you identified for each of your substantive arguments, figure out how you'll use your substantives to outweigh their attacks. Sixth, write an idea for an attention-getting device. It's always a good idea to have something to say at the beginning. I prefer third speakers come up with theirs in round, but it's better to have a backup plan in case you can't. And then seventh, get your team on the same page. At the end of your prep, when you're having your overall strategy meeting, you have to let them know what you think the most likely clashes will be, which arguments are most important for your team to win, which arguments are most threatening from your opponents, and make sure that if they had to make changes to their first and second speeches, that you become aware of those changes, because if you've planned everything out based on the second substantive and then the prep goes, oh, I actually changed my second substantive, then you need to get on the same page with that. The last part of this video is my biggest tips for how to be a strong third speaker. My first tip is do not wait too long to prep. Third speakers might not have the pressure of having to speak immediately once the hour is over, but you still have a lot to work on during the hour and during the debate before your speech. Waiting until right before your speech to figure out what you want to say in an event with no prep time will make it so that your speech is really hard to follow. You will drop really big arguments. You won't anticipate your opponent's biggest threatening arguments or attacks. While your first speakers are writing the case and the second speakers are writing the blocks, you should be identifying the clashes and writing your weighing analysis and how you would win each clash. This applies to impromptu and prepared motions. Just because they're writing the cases doesn't mean that you should be doing nothing. But second of all, don't be attached to your prep too much. Be willing to be flexible. Sometimes your opponents come up with really weird arguments that nothing you anticipated applies to them. Sometimes they totally defeat what you thought your strongest point was going to be, and you have to pivot your strategy. Sometimes they interpret the motion in a completely different way than you would have. And don't try to force clashes or themes or questions that don't fit, or try to use weighing analysis that doesn't apply. Be willing to let go of what you prepped. And if you're prepping correctly, where you're prepping the most threatening, strongest arguments they could come up with, then if they come up with something you didn't anticipate, it's probably not that good. So don't be afraid. Third, don't forget your partners. Anytime that you extend a framing point or one of your first 2 substantive arguments, give your first speaker a shout out. Anytime that you extend a third substantive or previous refutation or rebuilding, give your second speaker a shout out with their names. Do the same thing for great points of information answers and questions, and don't forget to ask them for help before the tournament and in impromptu prep and in the round if you need it. The 3 other tips for, third speaking like a pro. Fourth is what to do in your proposition. Plan to use your speech to set up the reply. Your speech is the last thing that a judge will hear before they get 12 minutes of content from the opposition, which your partner will get 1/3 of that time to answer. If your team isn't way ahead of the opposition by the end of your speech on the most crucial issues, the debate is probably over and you're going to lose. You need to work with your reply speaker to make sure that any of the arguments they need to win the round or avoid losing the round are effectively handled in your speech. The opposition is a bit different. You need to plan to be distinct from your reply. Your speech happens right before your reply. There's the opposition block, but it's not like the neg block in policy debate where you split the arguments between the two of you. Instead, you don't want to force them to correct you if you got something wrong or just repeat everything you said. Your job in the third opposition speech is to win the individual arguments in the round. The reply's job is to prove that you have won the entire debate because you did win the individual arguments. That means that you need to focus a little bit more on the factual, the mitigation and the denying level of the debate, and the directional turning level of the debate, rather than just on weighing. Weighing is still important, but your reply can do more weighing than you need to. But you have to make sure that any arguments your reply wants to use to weigh the round have been covered by your clashes. The final technique is don't neglect style. Your speech might need a little bit less fluff than a first or second speaker. Maybe the introduction is shorter, but that does not mean that you don't have to be charismatic, commanding, or convincing. You have the most amount of time of anyone on your team to plan out what you want to say, to plan one-liners, points of information, great examples, funny jokes. You also have the least amount of stuff prepared going in, so you need to have practice speaking off the cuff. So do impromptu, do extemp, do drills all the time. That brings us to the end of this video of how to be a third speaker in World Schools debate by crafting convincing crystallization. My name is Jet Smith, and hopefully this was helpful for you. I hope that you enjoy doing World Schools debate and expect to see the reply video very soon.